Good afternoon. Welcome to the University of Oslo. Welcome to this beautiful room. We are very pleased that this is a packed room here, a full house. My name is Dan Bannock, and I'm a professor of political science at the University of Oslo. This is the Circle U Open Conversation. Most of you know that Circle U is a European University Alliance of 9 universities. We have representatives from most of these universities here in the room today, and we have a fantastic panel here. The topic today is democracy in the balance, climate, conflict, and the politics of sustainable development. A lot of the students from Europe assembled here for an intensive week to talk about the politics of sustainable development, and this is something that a lot of my colleagues from Circle U are co-teaching with me. And it's also nice to see some people I've known over the years here, the usual suspects in the audience, but I wish to express a special welcome to all our online viewers. I know that 24 of my PhD students at Addis Ababa University are watching us online, as are students from all parts of the world, including my dad in India, and many people in Latin America, Asia, China, etc. So welcome. We are going to have a discussion which will last around an hour. The first 40 minutes of it would be with these people here, these 4 fantastic panelists, and then around 11:40 local time, I will introduce 2 student fellows that we've recently engaged with at Circle U, who will join the conversation. So without further ado, I wish to introduce this fantastic panel. So the first person on my right is Christina Bø. She is the Secretary General of the Norwegian EV Association, who is very active in public discourse, not just in the country, but also in Europe and the rest of the world. Maybe also talking a lot about what other countries can learn from our experience. So we'll get back to that. Christina, welcome. To her right is Dr. Margherita De Candia. She is a lecturer in political science education at King's College London. She has been co-teaching this course with me and has done extensive work on politics in Europe, including the role of far-right groups, and more recently has shown greater interest in looking at how politicians in Europe are actually figuring out their interest or disinterest in climate change. To her right is Torbjørn Røe Isaksen, who is our political alibi in the sense that he used to be a politician for the Conservative Party in Norway. And then, surprisingly enough, he resigned politics and joined the media. So he has been our Minister of Education, Industries, if I've forgotten something else, I don't, but he's just been a politician for a long time, and a very popular politician at that. And now he is the editor of E24, which is part of one of the most important influential media groups in Norway. So it'll be particularly interesting to hear how he's made that transition, and whether he regrets it. And then, last but not least, you don't?
No.
Okay. Last but not least is my colleague from the University of Oslo, Arve Hansen, who's a research professor at the Center for Development and the Environment. And he's done extensive work on consumption. And much of his work also is from a part of the world that is not necessarily considered very democratic, Vietnam. Okay, so I want to get us started. We don't really have an agenda. The first set of issues that I thought we could talk about is the relationship between democracy, climate, sustainable development. And I wanted to start with you, Margherita, particularly because when I heard you speak yesterday, the short story is that Europe was seen to be a climate leader. Right? The European Parliament, the Commission, the Green Deal. But now there's a populist wind that is sweeping across our continent, and much of that optimism to do something about the climate is changing. Can you tell us more about that, please?
Thank you, Dan. And just
want to start by saying that it's a pleasure to be here. So hello everyone in the room and online.
I think there's something wrong with this. So we just go over to the other one.
Okay. Does it work? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so going back to your question, you're right. The European Union and the European Parliament in particular have been traditionally considered environmental champions, so they've been pushing European states, but also the global arena to be ambitious when it comes to climate policy. Now, that was possible also because a lot of policy making was happening behind the curtain, so behind the eyes of the public, right, in a quite technocratic fashion. Of course, the European Parliament comprises people who have been elected by European citizens, so there is the democratic bit there. But we know that the European public doesn't really pay attention as much to the European Parliament. Things are changing now, but traditionally has been quite a secluded arena. And that made it easy for these institutions to be ambitious because you didn't really have to engage in a public debate. Now, things are changing. Climate change has become part of this debate, maybe not as much as some would wish. We were talking with the students yesterday how in 2019, climate change was perceived as more of a priority by the public. If you compare public opinion, you will see that today, compared to 2019, for example, people are losing interest in this issue, which is quite paradoxical if you think about how climate change is only getting worse. Okay, so climate change is become more politicized, and this is where things become harder. It becomes harder for the European Union, the European Parliament, to remain as ambitious, especially as some actors, notably the far-right parties, are entering the debate, and most of these parties have a skeptical position of climate change, if not a denialist position. So, I think I lost track of the original question.
No. You're very much on track.
Okay.
But why don't we bring Tourbjørn into the conversation? Mm-hmm. Is there a way in which you see, Tourbjørn, an evolution in that discourse from, say, when you were minister, maybe from the time, maybe before the pandemic, where there was, in my view, much more of a political interest, even societal interest in green transitions, and now it seems there's defense, there's energy, many other things that have crowded out that enthusiasm we had for the green transition. Or, what are your thoughts there?
No, I would agree, though I don't think it's necessarily a permanent feature. But I would compare it to, there's a quote, I can't remember by whom, who says that you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. And in a way, there's a similarity here, because what I think a very important reason, apart from the populist hard right, but also the changing emphasis, which means that now it's all about defense. Security has become like the new hot issue, also energy security. But I think we're in a different phase now. And why do I compare it to poetry and prose? Because if you just rewind 5, 6, 7 years back, the debate in Norway, in Europe, it was still to a certain extent about goals. How much should you lean forward? How ambitious should we be? And we were starting to try to work out an actual climate policy that can achieve those goals. Now we're in the more in the implementation phase. And the problem with implementation is that it's more prose than poetry. It's more difficult. It has more. It feels more present in people's lives. So whether or not it's a carrot or a stick, and it's also in a way more messy, because at the same time as most European parties and most of the European political community acknowledges that you need to have a progressive climate policy. It's easy to go wrong as well. I mean, there are a policy, just because you say it's green and it's a part of the green transition and it can benefit climate, doesn't necessarily mean it's the smartest policy compared to alternative policies, alternative uses of the funding, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's an important factor as well. So if I just to conclude, so I would argue, and this is or my hypothesis, because this is not empirically based, my hypothesis would be not that the hard right is creating the backlash, but they're in a way surfing the backlash.
Mm-hmm. But this is where, Margherita, one of the things you mentioned yesterday is that it's not like all far-right parties are against the environment. Some actually embrace it in the sense that they like to profile this as being pure, certain values that have to be persisted with, and that is used as an excuse or justification for exclusion, particularly in relation to immigration policies. Right? Would you?
Yeah, you're right. Interestingly, the more we go to the extreme side of the far right, the more likely we are to find parties that are actually talking about the environment, who care about the environment. Now, the problem, in my view, is how they frame the issue and who they blame for environmental problems. So what they do, in line with their nationalistic worldview, is to link climate change, environmental problems with the issue of migration. So suddenly migrants are responsible for the issues that we are facing. Think about the question of resource depletion, overpopulation. So the idea that these parties are circulating is that the native population is facing increasing pressure coming from non-native population who are coming to our countries, use our resources, contribute to the degradation of the environment.
Right.
This is a very dangerous argument. The problem is that we know how anti-migration feelings have been on the rise. And so the worry is that some voters may be attracted by this because, okay, we are all worried, not all of us, but more and more people are worried about climate change. If you offer the easy solution that the problem is migrants and the solution is to get rid of them, I'm worried about the electoral success of these parties.
Right. Just to stay on this issue, and I'll soon get to the two of you, Torbjörn, that is not necessarily the case in a country like Norway. I'm thinking of a conversation you and I have had several years ago where we were talking about why the Green Party's support is not as much as it was before. And I think you said something like many of the major political parties have adopted the green agenda. So you don't really have these specialist parties. But the kind of stuff that Margherita is saying, do you see tendencies of that in our parts of the world?
Obviously, I think this is a tendency, not the link between climate change and immigration. But of course, a very compelling argument if you wanted to persuade someone from the hard right that it's smart to do something about climate policy is that obviously climate change is going to increase migration streams. Obviously, and isolated, it will also increase migration pressure on Europe. But there's a coupling together of issues, which is very interesting. So in most countries, in Norway as well, our right populist party, it's not hard right, but it's a right-wing populist party, are both immigration skeptical or anti-immigration, but also skeptical towards very forward-leaning climate policies. They go together in a way. We talked about this earlier. I find it interesting that logically, they don't necessarily have to go together. I mean, you could be, of course, if you're a fundamental anti-globalist, so you see this as, in the Trumpian worldview, you see this as part of a globalized elite agenda to have more immigrants and more climate policies in order to make life horrible for the rest of us. Okay, that's one box. But if you look at the issues separately, it's fully consistent to be both. I mean, you can fully consistently be both very strict on immigration policy and also in favor of a progressive or a I struggle to find the Norwegian word. It's not offensive, but offensive. What's the English word for that?
Almost like positive, extrovert.
Yeah, progressive climate policy. But of course, empirically, very few parties hold those two things together.
Yeah. Okay, so let me bring Christina into the conversation. So if there's one thing, we'll just have to share the microphone, be very democratic about this. If there's one thing that Norway is being talked about in the rest of the world, in positive terms, it is our embrace of EVs. So I've lived in Palo Alto, California, and Oslo, and these are the two sort of places where you find lots of Teslas. And this has been a part of our discourse. Even today, we're talking about losing perhaps some of the benefits that we had as EV drivers. But the story so far is that this is perhaps a successful case of public policy nudging us all to change our behavior, moving away from diesel and petrol cars to EVs. So, Christina, you represent the EV Association. What would you highlight as being the most sort of successful policy initiative that got us now, I think, is it over 90% of us buying electric cars in Norway? What would you highlight as having changed our attitudes in terms of these EVs?
Well, I think it's both quite a bit of luck and quite a bit of hard work that has gotten Norway to where we are. April, we saw that it was actually 97% of new car sales were fully electric cars. And we're also seeing a lot happening in other segments as well, like heavy-duty transport. We're at 13% of new sales now, including the most heavy trucks. Actually, the uptake is even higher when you look at ferries. We have lots of ferries in Norway, and more than 80 of our ferries are now fully electric, because it makes sense economically as well. It saves a lot. Also, City of Oslo has done a lot to make construction sites electric, which it stands for a lot of the emissions in a city, and so on and so forth. But it started with the cars, and part of the luck was that Norway hasn't really had their own car industry. We have a company that produces parts, but we don't have Volkswagen.
We had the little Think.
We had the Think. So the car that was, we have had a car that was made in Norway, actually two, that was produced, an electric car. So at some point, this was the early stages, early 1990s, is when we started removing taxes on electric cars. And at that time, we saw that sort of different forces came together. On the one side, environmentalists, and on the other side, industry. They found together because they wanted to sort of promote this small car production. So that was part of the luck. Another lucky thing, I think, is the Norwegian political system. We have a multi-party system, and the parties mostly need to collaborate. Seldom we have a majority government. Right now we have a one-party government, which means they need to seek agreement with other parties, which makes it easier for the lobbyists. So the Norwegian EV Association represent EV drivers. We now have 120,000 members, drivers of electric cars that are a member to both support what we do, but mostly also because we offer some benefits by being a member. But of course, for us, we could influence, especially the parties that were more sort of into the environmental issues. But I would also say, also the bigger parties has, like the Conservative, the Labour Party, they have also embraced this more or less. And I think that has also been part of why we have succeeded in Norway, that it hasn't been politicized in the same way as, for example, in the US. So it has been quite a cross-party agreement that promoting electric mobility is a smart thing. And of course, because Norway is also a small country, the distance between the parliament, the politicians, and the civic society isn't that large. Yeah. So it also makes it easier for us to sort of talk to politicians, to bureaucrats, and to collaborate. Norway is a very small country.
So that is interesting that there was this political consensus, largely, but there was also the matter of providing concrete incentives for us to change behavior, removing the VAT, allowing us to drive in the bus lanes, parking free, How important were those incentives?
It's been extremely important because electric cars have for a long time been a lot more expensive to produce. And of course, consumers are conservative when it comes to paying up what is needed for a new car. A new car is extremely expensive. So to make people start doing this, and we did this early when the range of the cars was quite low. We didn't have charging stations. Still, we started buying these cars because there were incentives in place. But I think that in the beginning, in the 90s, early 2000, the VAT was removed in 2001. At that time, most people just thought, these cars are cute. It's a small thing driving past you in the bus lane. Something changed when Tesla came in 2013, and the Tesla Model S passed you in the bus lane. There was more opposition later in the process. And I think the most impressive thing in Norway is that we've kept at it for such a long time.
But there was also criticism.
A lot of criticism.
So because the government had told us, this is the politics, there was a particular finance minister who said, you guys should actually buy diesel. Diesel is better. And so we all bought diesel. And then we were told, okay, no, diesel is not that good. So there's polluting. And so the politics also plays out now in the sense that we still have political parties saying, these are for rich urban people in the districts, in the rural areas. We need something else.
It's actually quite interesting what Torbjørn was saying about the Progressive Party, which is maybe not, it's the sort of most right-wing party in Parliament. They were part of the parliamentary agreement that 100% of new car sales in Norway should be zero emission in 2025. That has been the goal that we've been sort of working towards. However, it's been a bit of a change with the Progressive Party, that especially the last year or so. In the media right now, they are trying to sort of create a narrative saying that we don't want ICE cars to be banned, which has never been an issue. They've never been banned, and we want people to have options. So that is a lot of their narrative right now. So I think they have been more positive, but now they're trying to sort of maybe use some of the consumers that are maybe a little bit more skeptical. And sort of to reach those voters by sort of trying to make this discussion into more of a problem than what it is. And it's interesting because it's not an urban thing in Norway anymore. Last year, I think it was at least 6 counties that had a higher market shares than Oslo. And we're talking Trøndelag, further north, Møre og Romsdal, areas in Norway, which is a lot more rural. Yeah. Because now the cars have long enough range and we have good infrastructure.
Yeah. Sorry, Arve, I'll soon get you into the conversation. You're not being excluded, but Torbjørn asked for a quick word.
Yeah. I think that just to use this as an example of a broader topic and my theory that we're now in a different phase. Because yesterday our revised budget came and our finance ministry, Jens Stoltenberg, the previous NATO General Secretary, his ministry issued a report, and there was an appendix there that said, how did we spend our oil money? To make the point brief, part of it was that we've lost a lot of revenue because of EV subsidies, indirect subsidies. Yeah. And so I think that the most critical people you would find for this policy right now would be economists. Because they would say, okay, we've lost about $8 billion over the past years in revenue. There's a 90%, I think, new car sales are EVs. Is this now an effective climate policy, or is it just a indirect subsidy to the middle class?
Affluent people. Yeah. We'll get back to this. I just don't want to exclude Arve from this conversation, but just staying on this matter of nudging people, changing behavior, another issue apart from the EV that has in some periods attracted attention, particularly when, say, the Lancet Commission's reports and in organizations like EAT, have been advocating less consumption of meat, which is good for the climate. It's also good for the health, apparently. But that kind of nudging, Arve, does not always gain traction. And you've been doing quite a lot of work on meat. So tell us a little bit about how that turns out if you tell people to eat less, and what kind of persuasive arguments are out there that can convince people to change their behavior.
Yeah, it was thank you for that question. And it was an interesting experience for me to start working on meat. I've been working on meat in Asia for a while, but working on meat in Norway, and to realize how heated the debate is. I kind of knew, but it's explosive. I didn't know how explosive it was. But the EV policy is very interesting, actually, because, and in comparison to all other consumption domains, because it shows what is possible if you have long-term and really focused attempts at changing behavior. But also we need to remember that actually the EV policy or a transition to electric vehicles very often doesn't require radical change in behavior, right? It's a substitution of a technology. And that's why many in the meat side of things also have high hopes for meat substitutes, right? That you can quite easily change.
You mean stuff that tastes like meat but is actually
not? Pretends to be meat. So we keep having new technologies there as well, pretending to be meat, or even calling themselves meat, or the companies would call it plant meat, for example, which pisses off people in the meat industry quite a lot. So there is that hope in the meat side of things as well. But what we quite clearly see is that there is not that kind of concentrated effort in changing eating behavior. And that whether you focus on obesity or meat eating, it's the same kind of results that we find, that people alone, individuals alone, are not able to make that change. Most of us, there are always a few that are able, but most are not able to make that change unless social and material structures, arrangements around us help us to do that. So that's where nudging comes in. And we know from nudge theory that nudges, like different policies for making people change towards electric cars, work as long as the nudge is there. But it doesn't work in the long term if you take away the policy, necessarily.
So when we think about reducing our consumption, and this is something that a lot of students are interested in, there's a lot of research on how can we reduce while at the same time many other countries are increasing, particularly in the global south, where meat consumption is perhaps increasing in the Indias and Chinas, etc., where we are trying to reduce. So if you think about our parts of the world in Europe, we live in democratic societies, and by the way, democracy is supposed to be very good at resolving conflicts. We're supposed to talk about it and discuss and debate the pros and cons. In terms of consumption, Arve, how do these debates play out? I mean, we should be flying less, eating less meat, etc., driving electric cars. Has it become much more about individual change of behavior? Is that what people react to? Are they waiting for politicians to change certain laws and provide greater incentives? How do you see these issues?
Yes, I think people are waiting for governments to take action. It's a very tricky issue, right? Because I think we need to be quite specific in what is it that we want to change. Very often discussions of consumption and overconsumption end up in this kind of moralistic debate about we overconsume. In many cases it's not a we, it's some overconsume. Norway overconsumes, but the richest people in Norway overconsumes a lot more than most other, for example. So there are these questions of equality and responsibility there as well. There are really tricky, difficult democratic questions. And I think you're perfectly right in saying that we very often end up with this kind of individual responsibilization of consumption. And of course, individuals should have some responsibility in how we consume and how we treat the environment and animals and so on. But I always argue that and this is based on research as well, and what we know about how consumption patterns take form and change, and often don't change, is that these are social issues. They are societal issues. Consumption patterns are not mainly individual issues. They take shape through the society and the economies that we live in. And therefore, if we want to make like large-scale changes in consumption beyond that one person in Grünerløkka or wherever making changes. If we want society to change in a sustainable direction, we need to treat these issues as societal issues. And then we need different approaches to different segments of consumption.
But, okay, good. So then to return to the EV thing and politics, Christina, you said that we were lucky. The stars were aligned. We have hydropower, so it was not coal-fired power plants that were driving the EVs. Some people started to think this is a status symbol to have a Tesla, of course, so that helped. There were these incentives. But what about the trade-offs? Because there was also the criticism that they are too heavy, they're destroying our roads, more dust coming out of it. Oh, and some of the batteries, how can we recycle them? What about the cobalt and all the critical minerals coming from DRC Congo? Is that ethically produced? So how do you in your association address some of those concerns about recycling, perhaps the environmental costs of producing EVs, which is also pretty significant?
Well, it's all about data and numbers and know what you're talking about. And of course, this is what happened in Norway when in the beginning we had this few EVs on the road, a few people were buying them, and then as this increased, it increased quickly, because in 2012 the market share was 3%. So it's gone a bit more than 10 years, everything's turned around completely, and currently 30% of all passenger cars in the whole of Norway are full electric cars. So it's a big change in a short period of time. And of course, when this started accelerating, we got opposition here as well. And all these arguments came. And what is difficult with some of these arguments is that they're not necessarily untrue, but they're not necessarily completely true either. And for example, when it comes to the cobalt mines, it was later discovered that it was what they call these oil brothers in the US, Koch brothers. Something like that, yeah. They were behind spreading this story. And of course, it's terrible with cobalt mines that are not regulated, and you have kids on those mines. But part of the story is also we also use cobalt in fossil fuel cars. So cobalt is used in a lot of different products. What is the solution to that? What we did when this debate started was we started collaborating with Amnesty International to get more insight and to talk with them. And they were saying, we don't recommend stopping to use cobalt from Congo. The problem with Congo is that Congo is a failed state. We need to make sure that the cobalt that is produced in Congo is done in a sustainable way, or sustainable as a responsible way, at least, because mining can never be completely sustainable. A responsible way, and we need to have transparency in the whole value chain. That's the solution. But of course, so that's difficult. But yes, my answer really is you need to know what you're talking about. You need to understand that it's often complex situations and discussions. But there's no doubt, just to say that, there's no doubt that it's more climate friendly to buy and drive an electric car than an ICE-fueled car. There's no doubt. If you look at all the data and everything, even in Poland, which is mostly coal-powered, it makes sense to change to an EV. And why is that? Yes, because first of all, you get no local pollution immediately. Secondly, if you believe that you have to do something with climate change, I believe we can't wait until we have 100% renewable electricity production globally before we start changing the vehicles we use. We have to do both as fast as we can. Okay. And of course, the change to renewable energy is also happening fast.
Yeah. But does that explain, and Torbjørn, we've had a group here just this morning presented the deep sea mining case in Norway. And I learned a lot from that presentation because, it is cobalt, is a lot of the critical minerals that we will be mining. There has been a lot of concern, political debate. There is the incentive for job creation, reviving coastal towns, but also worry about all the environmental negative consequences. In one way, I was thinking, is this our way of saying, if we can get these critical minerals for what we need in terms of electric car batteries, that gives us better control, maybe we have better technology, cleaner technology, it's better than relying on China or DRC. What is your perspective on that debate, which was a big issue in the last election?
Well, I think it's an illustration of, Isaiah Berlin's point that all good things don't necessarily go together. So I think that if you look at, for example, there's no doubt that the combination of technological drive and the green transition will rapidly increase the demand for rare earth and minerals. There's also no doubt that it has a certain geopolitical security aspect, as China dominates a lot of these areas very massively as well. It has a human rights aspect. Congo is a good example of that. And so there might be trade-offs. So I think that there's a reason why this undersea mining comes now and didn't come 15 years ago. And it's a direct response to this. I would argue perhaps that the security aspect of this, geopolitical security aspect, is even more important than some of the other issues. But in a way, it's like the windmill dilemma in Norway. So we have a lot of wind. We have a lot of areas where we could have windmills onshore. They're profitable, but people don't want them. Why? Because they're ugly. They're loud. They kill birds. I wouldn't want one in my backyard, but I live in central Oslo, so I'm
There's
one
a
of the...
humming noise that...
There's a humming noise. And it's a dilemma, so it just shows why has the climate debate become more messy than it was 5 or 6 years ago. So in Norway, the windmills have been one of the things, onshore windmills, one of the things that's basically shifted opinion and made people more skeptical, even though from both an economic and a climate perspective, it makes more than sense. It makes 100% sense.
Indeed, and that is a case that we've been discussing in class too, that it, on the one hand, it makes perfect sense, but it also tramples on certain people's rights and preferences. It could be indigenous groups, and the same...
And that's, of course, another important thing in Norway is that a lot of these areas are in the feeding grounds for reindeer, which
That's correct. But it also feeds into this geopolitical discussion we have on overcapacity, that China, and I've seen some just fresh statistics, is alone responsible for most of the solar panels, the car batteries, etc. And the production is actually not so bad. I mean, most of the data showing that maybe it's not a bad thing that China is producing, but European countries are worried about the competition, right? So I want to also bring Margarita in. I mean, some of what you're hearing us talk, how does it work in the UK? Do you hear some of these debates on EVs and climate, and now the UK is restarting coal plants, I think, again. So do you see some of this also happening in British politics?
Yes, I mean, I can give you the example of London. So local politics, we had the mayor's election recently, and Sadiq Khan is our mayor for his second term, and he's been working a lot on making London greener. And one of the key policies that he and his team have implemented is about increasing taxes to get into central London, and especially on vehicles that are older and that pollute more. Now, there was a lot of backlash on this, and indeed that led some voters swing to the Conservative Party and the far-right parties who were stressing a lot this issue. And I think this makes me think of the importance of including all the interests that are at stake. So you were talking about the incentives for consumers, so talking about, for example, how reducing meat consumption is good also for their health. But we shall not forget that there are also other groups that are affected, such as the meat industry. Now, you know, we are also talking about the livelihood of the meat industry. So what I want to say is that when we implement green policies, we need to take account of all those who are affected. You know, if you are a wealthy individual in London, you can afford an electric vehicle and you can afford to pay taxes if you have a polluting vehicle, but that's not the same for everyone. If you are from a disadvantaged background, you cannot afford an electric car because we don't have such a generous policy, unfortunately. We have some incentives, like you don't pay central zone, etc. But so if we want to really get people to support the green transition, we need to take account of all those who are affected by the costs of this transition.
Thank you. Now it is time. We have to introduce the students here. So can I please ask you two to come? First, Juliana Vorvik. She is a new Circle U student fellow. She studies law and international relations. Juliana, where do you guys want to maybe stand here along? And then Marte Landmark, she studies political science. And I've asked them to, I put them on the spot. I actually asked them just a few days ago, was it yesterday actually, to be a commentator, to represent the student perspective in what we've just been talking about. So Marte, you want to first... who wants to go first? You want to go first. Okay, Juliana first.
Okay, so hi. Thank you so much for a really interesting and insightful conversation and discussion so far. I found it really interesting how you discussed the incentives for consumers to change their behavior related to electrical vehicles or meat consumption in terms of motivation to make sustainable choices. And I'd like to ask you a question related to the student perspective and also the groups in our society that are less resourceful economically. Because I feel that making sustainable choices are often a contrast to economic interests for a lot of students and certain groups in our society. For instance, for students, going secondhand shopping, which is what we consider being sustainable, is often equally as expensive as going to a regular store and often more expensive than choosing fast fashion, for instance. So I'd like to ask you if you could reflect a bit on this problem of striking a balance between these
So this is for Christina. Okay, for the whole panel. Okay, maybe Arve. Christina first.
Yeah, I think that first of all, with electric cars, this is debated a lot, the equity question, and I think it's important to say a few things about that, because what Norway has done mostly is being at least in the beginning of this incentive and these tax exemptions, has been shifting wealth, really. And because the question is, who buys new cars? It's the same in Norway, India, Brazil, any country in the world. It's the richest people and mostly companies, actually. Most countries, at least half of new cars are bought by companies. So by not taxing, that's of course just helping rich people, but what Norway also has done has been increasing the taxes on ICE cars, internal combustion engine cars, more and more and more and more. So for example, plug-in hybrids in Norway, the last 3 years has gone up about 45,000 NOK each year in the purchase tax. So it's really about taxing the rich people, the companies that make the wrong choice, and benefiting the rich people and the companies that make the right choice. Most new cars that are bought each year is actually second-hand. Gradually, however, because these are the people that make the choices that sort of affects the rest of us. Gradually, these new cars become second-hand cars, and little by little, they are also available in the second-hand market for the rest of us. And that's the same in each country. And I think that it's a little bit, sometimes you cannot put equity and social issues always have to be sort of combined with environmental and climate issues. Sometimes you have to sort of focus on environment and climate, and then just sort of understand that little by little, this is the way to change it. But more taxes on new cars that pollute is, of course, the best way to do it, because then you make It's the polluter pays principle.
So we have now an upper limit of a certain amount of money. The luxury cars have to pay quite a lot, whereas until 500,000 Norwegian kroner
and
is
of course, cars should have VAT.
Yeah.
So we don't say that we should never have VAT on
right,
EVs,
because
but
the politicians are worried about the lack of
course,
revenue.
they should be VAT on cars. But this has been a very, very good way to change the cars people buy, and gradually now we can reintroduce the VAT because the cars are more competitive.
Arve, quickly.
Yeah, I think the question is spot on in many ways, and it resonates a lot with the research that we've done on consumption, where we see that consumers find it too difficult, and also in many cases too expensive, but also too difficult to be sustainable, whatever that means. That can mean a lot of different things, in a society that is not. And again, the electric vehicles is an example where there's a lot of effort put into changing consumption. That kind of effort is not put into most other unsustainable consumption patterns.
Why not?
A lot of different reasons, depending on what we're looking at. Very often economic reasons. It also has to do with livelihoods, for example. It has to do with farming in Norway, for example. There are ways of addressing this, of course. Most of those who are arguing for eating less meat are not arguing for stopping producing meat in Norway. It's just like doing it differently, producing less. But it's a question of regulations as well, and what is possible. So we see that quite clearly in ultra-fast fashion, for example, which is a big thing now. So far, it's been difficult to regulate this, but it has to be done, and that has to be done on the production side, quite clearly, I think, because we cannot expect, and we know this from research and lived life, we cannot expect consumers, the majority of consumers, to avoid buying what's really cheap. If there's a desire, if there's a demand for that kind of product. So we know this quite clearly, that we need regulation, and we need help. But it's not only economically; it's also in terms of what some call consumption work that you, as a consumer, have to put into consuming differently. Yeah. So if you want secondhand of all kinds of stuff compared to buying new stuff, it takes a lot of effort going around town to pick up stuff, for example.
And one case that we've been discussing quite a lot is the Chinese net giant Temu. Yep. Where, in Norwegian politics, but also in Europe, it has to do with how cheaply, things are being sent to us and the environmental impacts of it. But we've also been discussing in class that what really trumps everything else is price. If it is affordable, that's where the consumers go. But I want to bring Marte into the conversation. Marte, what is your comment? Any reflections you have? Any questions you have to the panel?
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to build on Juliana's question and also what you mentioned on individual consuming. So in a democratic society, how should we prioritize, or how do we prioritize individual freedom of choices versus collective solutions for a sustainable future? So I wanted to bring on an example as well. So I worked at the student festival, and everyone got a free meal when you volunteered, and all the meals would be vegetarian. So for example, those kind of solutions, should it be collectively decided, or should the individual decide? Or should it, for example, also be mandatory to take classes on sustainability at universities? So how do you balance this?
Should we start with Torbjørn, putting you on the spot here?
Well, it's sort of a question that goes to the core of politics. so it's obviously, but there are different. I think it's fruitful to try to categorize different political actions. So obviously, some things are legitimate to ban. You could ban certain toxics, for example. You could say we don't want DDT in our pesticides, etc., etc. Other things are you don't ban meat. I think that would be dramatic. But other things is where you try to have economic incentives. So I think that's the obvious solution. The problem is, of course, that, as we've touched on several times, economic incentives are not neutral. So, for example, if you had a tax on clothes, for example, You could obviously have a very high tax on clothes. You could have a higher tax on cheaper clothes. It's not difficult to do, sort of a VAT system. That would obviously be more damaging to people with a low income than people with a high income, which sort of touches on the dilemma. So politically, I would argue that one of the difficulties is, of course, that you're trying to shape the whole structure of society. But there's an easier way of doing this, and it's as you increase direct taxes, for example, on pollution or climate unfriendly behavior, you lower income taxes, especially for the middle and lower groups. So that is a way of trying to balance it.
But there's also another.
I also have a question about whether secondhand is really that good for the climate.
Okay, we can. I've actually done some work on second-hand clothing in Africa, but that's for another day. But I wanted to just ask you, Torbjørn, because you're the political alibi we have in this room, having been actively engaged in politics and being a minister. If you can reflect on your period of being that active politician or being a decision maker, would you often come across cases where it was a question of economics, jobs, growth versus something else that was environmental friendly, but you had to make that trade-off?
Well, in the long run, obviously, there's a trade-off. I think very seldom do you have that very direct trade-off, like we close this factory, because what we've done in most economies is you phase out that factory. You don't close it overnight, you phase it out, or it adapts, like Norwegian industry, for example. But I think that one of the challenges for politicians now is that, in a way, we've oversold the green shift, because what we told people was that you can have it both ways. So you can live the life that you do today. It's just going to be more environmentally friendly. There are only upsides to this. We'll get new jobs. They'll be more exciting and they'll pay more, which I still think has a certain amount of truth to it. But of course, the challenge is that the way from A to B is always challenging. And in politics, the proof is always in the pudding. It's not just about getting to B. It's about how you get there.
Right. That is interesting. Christina and Margarita, Arve, the students, I just want to think about, us to reflect a bit on these trade-offs, but also at the global level, and including all the skeletons that we have perhaps in our closet. I mentioned deep-sea mining, but also, Christina, I'm sure when you go around the world and you talk about EV, etc., I'm sure you're asked, but Norway is the 5th largest producer of oil. How does that square with this image of being clean and green? So what is it that you usually respond to?
I got that question so many times that I actually made a name for it.
Okay.
It's the Norway's rich argument. Norway's rich argument. And of course, again, we haven't used oil money to sort of help electric cars. What Norway does is actually possible to be done in other countries too, at least partly. Most other countries don't have high taxes on new cars. Some do, but not a lot doesn't. And there's actually quite a few countries that we work with a lot of. We had quite a bit of funding from the Climate Works Foundation in the US to work with, especially quite a few South American countries, South Africa, India, different countries. And there are other countries in the global south that are doing some of the similar things that Norway has done. They start removing import tax on electric cars, and they also start slowly increasing taxes on ICE cars. That is necessary in a country with less wealth. It's possible to do that as long as you redistribute. It doesn't sort of have a heavy weight on the budget. So that can be done by different countries, and it's actually possible to adopt. But of course, it's politically difficult. It's politically difficult to do this, but it's possible to do partly what Norway has done.
But are we outsourcing our pollution elsewhere?
Yes.
Yes, and this is also the economists that Torbjørn was talking about. Yeah. It's easy to just purchase quotas from instead of doing it ourselves. And I think that a country like Norway has responsibility to test out new solutions and actually show the world that it's possible.
Torbjørn?
Yeah, but Again, back to my main point that we're in a different phase now of the discussion, because 5 or 6 or 10 years ago, you could just be pro-climate something, pro-climate policy. But then it turns out that there are very fundamentally, even ideologically different ways of approaching this. And one of the arguments is, of course, if you want to have a coherent argument about Norway being a oil and gas producer, a massive oil and gas producer, at the same time doing a green transition, well, that argument has to lean towards the solution for this is a technological shift. So what we need to do is spend this money in order to have a technological shift, be early adapters, etc. If you don't believe that argument, it doesn't make sense. But the point is, climate change is not really, it's not like either you're for it or against it. There are so many different political opinions about how to get to sound climate policies, which is part of politics.
Yeah. Arve?
Yeah, we need to remember it's not all about climate either. Climate is of course crucial, but there's also a nature crisis. There are a lot of different crises. There's the crisis of the availability of materials to produce all the stuff that we're using. And we have very rapidly growing middle classes in other parts of the world that are consuming more, although they're mostly very far away from the consumption levels in these parts of the world. But I wanted to respond to the question, are we outsourcing our pollution? We quite clearly are. And if we look at where the stuff that rich countries consume is produced, that takes place elsewhere most of the time, right? So we are completely dependent on China and other Asian countries for consuming all the stuff that we do. And this kind of much of the explosion in consumption is related to the fact that consumers, both in rich countries and in poorer countries, many consumers have a lot more money to spend, while the wages of workers have not gone up in other parts of the world, or at least not gone up anywhere close to that level. And to respond to the excellent question here, it quite clearly, we need to somehow get to the point where it's not down to the individual consumer to decide whether the clothing we buy is produced by or made by people who get a decent living wage or not. And it should not be up to us as individual consumers to decide whether the animal behind our eggs or cheese or meat is mistreated or not in the production. That cannot be the individual consumer's responsibility. But it
can be the individual concern, but not the responsibility.
Right.
It could be our concern. We may be interested in knowing about it.
Absolutely,
yeah.
But we should not have that choice.
We have 3 minutes. Juliana, Martti, you want to come in? Is there anything you would like to respond to? Anything else you would like to follow up with? I don't want to put you on the spot, but...
Well, I would first like to thank you for your answers, and I found it, I think it's very interesting what Marta also followed up with about the case of individual choice. We're very glad that we have the choice in Norway. So I guess I don't really have an exact question, but
why don't we have just some closing 1 minute sort of thing? I know that we've just covered quite a bit of terrain. Maybe some would say it's a bit unfocused, but I thought this was really fun. Christina, would you like to sort of sum up anything that you really think should be the take-home message today?
I think that most importantly, I think people, individuals, can help by sort of believing that it's possible. It is possible to make changes. It is possible to change the cars we drive. It is possible to make Oslo into a livable city. It's a very nice and livable city. And Oslo has actually both combined having electric transport, but also keeping the transport, not increasing the amount of transport, which is possible. You have to have different policies in combination to make to both cut climate emissions, but also make our life sort of nicer and better. And this is possible, and that's why I think it's also the responsibility of Norway and also other countries to show, and because showing is sort of seeing is believing. And that's something I think is important in addition to the sort of economic policy and overall quota discussions and everything.
Thank you. 30 seconds,
Yes.
Margarita.
Just to add an alternative perspective to economic incentives, how do we make the green transition attractive to voters? Well, we could resort to participatory democracy. In addition to elections, remember, politicians want to be re-elected, and to do so they need to persuade the public. Through citizens' assembly, we can also achieve that.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. No, that was perfect. Torbjörn.
Okay. So I would just point out that we have a limited amount of resources in every society. So that means that ineffective, more expensive than the alternative green policies or climate policies are neither good economically nor for the climate.
Okay. Marte first, if you have anything.
Well, I could.
And I'll give Arve the last word.
Just maybe an observation in general as well, after talking to many of the students and observing just how the trend has been in society. I think also it's important to remember to think of the environmental crisis and how to solve it as a goal and not use it as a means in terms of greenwashing, or if it's far right that uses the crisis for their own goals. So just an observation.
Excellent. Arve, you get to have the last word.
Thank you. I will stick to the sustainability as a societal issue as my main point. And that means that we need to start asking some really tough questions, but also interesting questions about what a sustainable society looks like. But in doing that, we also need to think beyond national borders. We need global perspectives on what our sustainable world and sustainable societies within that look like. And that there needs to be always need to be the justice element in that as well.
Okay, it is 12 noon. I want to thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Bella, and all the others who've helped in terms of the technical aspects. Thanks to Circle U for hosting this open conversation. There's a whole series of conversations that we are planning throughout the year on elections, on climate change, you name it, on global health. So please follow our website, and please give a warm hand to this excellent panel. Thank you very much. Tusen tack, väldigt bra. Tack. And you may want to interact with some of them now, now that the streaming is over, if they have time, and you can interact with them. Tusen tack.